May 31st, 1944. 2:36 in the morning, 50 miles northeast of Manus Island in the Bismarck Archipelago. Lieutenant Junichi Inoue stood motionless in the cramped control room of RO 105, listening to the hydrophones relay the unmistakable sound of destroyer propellers churning overhead. For the past 5 hours, his submarine had been hunted by American destroyer escorts, twisting through evasive maneuvers in water, barely 300 feet deep. The attacks had been relentless, methodical, terrifying in their persistence. But something about this latest approach felt different. The destroyer had maintained sonar contact throughout its run, an impossibility according to everything Inoue had learned about anti-submarine warfare. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. There should have been a blind period, those critical seconds when the attacking ship lost contact as it closed the distance, giving him a chance to change course, to slip away into the silent depths. Instead, the pinging had continued without interruption until the destroyer passed directly overhead. Then, silence. No depth charges rolling off the stern, no underwater explosions blooming in the darkness. Nothing. Inoue exchanged a confused glance with his executive officer. Perhaps the Americans had malfunctioned, their weapons failing to release, or perhaps they were using some new hunting tactic, waiting for him to reveal his position. The temperature in the submarine had climbed past 100 degrees Fahrenheit. 55 men breathed the same recycled air, their bodies slick with sweat, their nerves stretched to breaking. They had been submerged for 28 hours. 6 minutes later, without warning, the ocean itself seemed to tear apart around them. Not the familiar rolling thunder of depth charges exploding at distance, but something immediate, something catastrophic. Multiple impacts struck RO 105's pressure hull in rapid succession, each one punching through steel that had been designed to withstand the crushing pressure of 600 feet of seawater. There was no time for emergency procedures, no time for anything except the terrible mathematics of submarine death. At 300 feet depth, seawater enters a breached pressure hull at approximately 400 gallons per minute through a 3-inch hole. RO 105 had been struck by at least 6 projectiles. The flooding was instant and catastrophic. As water roared into the submarine, the atmospheric pressure inside began to climb, and with it, the temperature. Within 90 seconds, the air temperature exceeded 200 degrees Fahrenheit, searing the lungs of every man aboard. The boat settled deeper, accelerating the flooding, increasing the pressure, raising the temperature even higher. By the time RO 105 reached her crush depth 4 minutes after being struck, every member of her crew was already dead. What neither Lieutenant Inoue nor his men understood in those final moments was the nature of the weapon that had killed them. They died without knowing that the British had invented a forward-throwing anti-submarine mortar that eliminated the blind time submarines depended on for survival. They died without understanding that 24 small projectiles had been fired in an elliptical pattern ahead of the pursuing destroyer, landing in a circle 130 feet in diameter directly in their path. They died without comprehending that these projectiles, weighing 65 pounds each and carrying 35 pounds of Torpex high explosive, had sunk through the water at 23 feet per second, reaching their submarine's depth in less than 9 seconds, too fast for any evasive maneuver. The weapon was called Hedgehog, and by May of 1944, it had already changed the mathematics of submarine warfare in ways that neither German nor Japanese naval intelligence fully understood. What made Hedgehog revolutionary was not its explosive power, which was relatively immodest compared to depth charges, but its tactical properties and the profound psychological shift it created in underwater combat. For the first time in the history of submarine warfare, the hunted had no way of knowing they were under attack until the moment of impact. RO 105 was the 5th Japanese submarine sunk by the USS England in just 12 days, an achievement unparalleled in the annals of anti-submarine warfare. All 5 kills had been accomplished using Hedgehog, yet the significance of these sinkings extended far beyond the specific tactical successes of one destroyer escort. They represented the culmination of a technological evolution that had fundamentally altered the balance of power in the undersea war, an evolution that had begun 3 years earlier in the cold waters of the North Atlantic. To understand the revolution that Hedgehog represented, it is necessary first to understand the problem it was designed to solve. That problem was elegantly simple in principle but devastatingly complex in practice: how to sink a submarine that you could detect but could not see. The answer required not just new weapons, but an entirely new understanding of underwater acoustics, the geometry of attack, and the psychology of submarine combat. By late 1941, Allied anti-submarine warfare had reached a technological impasse. ASDIC, the British sound detection system known to Americans as sonar, could locate submerged submarines with reasonable accuracy at ranges up to 2,000 yards. This was revolutionary compared to the First World War, when submarine detection had relied primarily on visual sighting of periscopes or the physical sight of torpedo tracks. But ASDIC had a critical weakness that German U-boat commanders had learned to exploit with devastating effectiveness. The speed of sound in seawater is approximately 4,900 feet per second, significantly faster than in air but still finite. When an ASDIC operator transmitted a sound pulse toward a submarine and waited for the echo to return, the time between transmission and reception allowed calculation of the submarine's distance. This worked effectively at medium ranges, but as the attacking ship closed to within 200 yards, the time required for the sound pulse to reach the submarine and return became so short that the human operator could no longer distinguish between the outgoing pulse and the returning echo. They merged into what was called an instantaneous echo. At precisely the moment when the attacking destroyer needed the most accurate information, at the critical instant when depth charges were being prepared for release, the submarine became invisible to the ship's sensors. This was the blind time, and it typically lasted between 30 and 60 seconds depending on the submarine's depth and the attacker's speed. During this interval, a skilled U-boat commander could execute sharp changes in course and speed, often succeeding in evading the depth charge pattern that would shortly arrive at his former location. The standard Allied response to blind time was speed. Destroyers and corvettes would accelerate to maximum velocity during the final approach, attempting to minimize the duration of the blind period and reduce the submarine's opportunity to escape. But this created additional problems. Depth charges were heavy cylinders, each weighing between 400 and 600 pounds depending on the model, filled with between 200 and 600 pounds of high explosive. They were released from racks at the stern of the attacking ship or fired from K-gun throwers mounted amidships, devices that used compressed air or explosive charges to hurl the depth charges out to approximately 150 yards on either side of the ship's track. Once in the water, depth charges sank at rates varying from 8 to 14 feet per second, depending on their design. Mark 6 and Mark 7 depth charges, the standard types used through 1943, sank at 8 and 9 feet per second, respectively. The later Mark 9, introduced in 1944, achieved 14.5 feet per second. This meant that a depth charge set to explode at 300 feet, a typical attack depth, would take between 20 and 37 seconds to reach its detonation point after entering the water. During this interval, the submarine was traveling at whatever speed it could maintain underwater, typically between 2 and 8 knots, depending on battery charge and tactical situation. Even at moderate speed, a U-boat could cover significant distance while depth charges descended toward their preset detonation depth. The mathematical challenge for the attacking ship was to predict where the submarine would be 30 seconds in the future, based on information that was already 30 to 60 seconds old when the blind time began. The geometry of the attack imposed further constraints. Because depth charges were released from the stern or thrown to the sides, the attacking ship had to pass directly over or very close to the submarine's estimated position. This meant that the final approach had to be executed at high speed in a straight line, further reducing tactical flexibility and increasing the submarine's ability to predict the attack pattern and take evasive action. Moreover, depth charges relied on hydrostatic pressure to trigger their detonation. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Each charge was fitted with a pistol, a mechanical or later hydrostatic device that sensed water pressure and detonated the explosive when a preset depth was reached. This required the attacking ship to estimate the submarine's depth and set each depth charge accordingly before release. In the chaos of combat, with limited and often unreliable depth information, this estimate was frequently wrong. A submarine at 400 feet depth was completely safe from depth charges set to explode at 250 feet. Even when depth charges exploded at approximately the correct depth and location, their killing mechanism was indirect. The explosive detonation created a powerful shockwave that propagated through the water at the speed of sound. This shockwave could damage submarine equipment, crack hull plating, rupture pipes, and disorient the crew. But water is compressible, and the shockwave energy dissipated rapidly with distance. A cushion of water between the explosion and the submarine absorbed much of the destructive force. To sink a submarine with depth charges required either a very close near miss, within approximately 25 feet of the hull, or more typically, multiple explosions that caused cumulative damage over an extended period. The statistical evidence was brutal in its clarity. During the first years of the war, only approximately 3% of depth charge attacks resulted in confirmed submarine kills. This meant that 97 out of every 100 attacks failed to destroy the target. The Germans understood these limitations intimately. U-boat training programs at Gotenhafen and other bases included extensive instruction in depth charge evasion. Commanders learned to listen for the sounds of the attacking ship's approach, to time their evasive maneuvers to coincide with the onset of blind time, to go deep when possible, to vary speed and direction randomly, to create false targets using bubble generators or ejected debris. The more experienced commanders developed almost supernatural skill at evading attacks. U-427, for example, survived 678 depth charges dropped against it in April of 1945, finally escaping to return to base despite extensive damage. While this was an extreme case, many U-boats survived multiple depth charge attacks during single patrols. The psychological effect on Allied escort crews was corrosive. They would attack what seemed to be a solid sonar contact, expend hundreds of depth charges, see oil and debris rise to the surface suggesting a kill, only to learn weeks later from ultra-intelligence that the submarine had survived and was reporting back to Kriegsmarine headquarters. By mid-1941, British scientists and naval officers at the Directorate of Miscellaneous Weapons Development, known informally as the Wheezers and Dodgers, were wrestling with this fundamental problem. The solution they eventually developed was counterintuitive, even radical. Instead of trying to improve depth charges, they would eliminate them entirely from the initial attack. Instead of passing over the submarine and dropping weapons blind, they would fire projectiles ahead of the ship while sonar contact was still maintained. Instead of relying on shock waves propagating through water, they would use contact fuzzes that detonated only on direct impact with the submarine's hull. The concept was not entirely new. The Royal Navy had experimented with head-throwing weapons earlier in the war, including a device called the Fairley mortar that had been tested aboard HMS Whitehall in 1941. The Fairley used conventional explosive charges fired from mortar tubes, but the system proved too heavy, too complex, and insufficiently accurate for practical deployment. The charges also lacked adequate explosive content, carrying only 20 pounds of explosive instead of the 60 pounds that calculations suggested would be necessary to penetrate a submarine's pressure hull. The breakthrough came through adapting a weapon system originally designed for entirely different purposes. Lieutenant Colonel Stuart Blacker of the Royal Artillery had developed a type of infantry mortar called a spigot discharger during the interwar period. Unlike conventional mortars, which used a tube to contain the explosive propellant and guide the projectile, a spigot mortar consisted of a fixed steel rod, the spigot, protruding upward from a base plate. The projectile, or bomb in military terminology, had a hollow tail that fitted over the spigot. The propellant charge was contained in the base plate, and when fired, it generated gases that pushed against the inside of the projectile's tail, launching the bomb upward and forward off the spigot. This design had several advantages for anti-submarine use. It was mechanically simple, requiring no complex barrel or breech mechanism. It allowed a single launcher to fire projectiles of different sizes and weights, and crucially, it was lighter than conventional mortars of comparable range and power. Major Millis Jefferies and the team at the Ministry of Intelligence Research adapted Blacker's spigot mortar design for naval use, working in partnership with the Directorate of Miscellaneous Weapons Development to create what would become Hedgehog. The final design consisted of 24 launcher spigots arranged in 4 rows of 6, mounted on a steel frame on the foredeck of escort vessels. Each spigot fired a projectile 7.2 inches in diameter and 46.5 inches long. The projectiles weighed 65 pounds, with 35 pounds of that weight being Torpex high explosive, a mixture 42% RDX, 40% TNT, and 18% powdered aluminum that was significantly more powerful than TNT alone. The nose of each projectile contained a contact fuse, a mechanical device that would detonate the Torpex only upon impact with a solid object. The spigots were angled, so that when all 24 projectiles were fired in rapid sequence, they would land in the water in an elliptical pattern, approximately 140 feet wide by 120 feet deep for the Mark 10 version, or a circular pattern 200 feet in diameter for the Mark 11. The entire pattern would land approximately 200 yards ahead of the ship's position at the moment of firing. The mathematics behind the pattern were complex, calculated using what was essentially a sophisticated roulette wheel device. Engineers placed a scale model of a submarine on this wheel and threw miniature projectiles at it thousands of times, recording the results to determine the optimal spacing and angles for the launcher spigots. The goal was to create a pattern dense enough that a submarine attempting to evade would be likely to run into at least one projectile, regardless of which direction it turned. Once the projectiles entered the water, they armed automatically and sank vertically at 23 feet per second, 3 times faster than the Mark 6 depth charges they were designed to supplement. At this sink rate, the projectiles would reach a submarine at 200 feet depth in under 9 seconds, and could engage targets as deep as 400 feet in less than 18 seconds, though experience would show that Hedgehog was most effective against submarines at depths between 100 and 300 feet. The contact fuse was perhaps the most technically challenging component of the entire system. It had to survive the violent shock of being fired from the launcher and the impact with the water surface without detonating prematurely. It had to arm reliably once submerged, and it had to be sensitive enough to detonate on contact with a submarine's hull, but robust enough not to detonate when the projectile struck the ocean floor if it missed the target. The solution involved an impeller, a small propeller in the nose that would spin as the projectile fell through the water. This spinning action would screw a striker into position against a spring-loaded firing pin. Once armed, any impact force above a certain threshold would release the firing pin, which would strike a detonator that would in turn initiate the main Torpex charge. If the projectile missed the submarine and reached the bottom, the fuse was designed to withstand the impact with mud or sand without detonating, though impacts with rock could sometimes trigger the fuse. The first operational test of Hedgehog came aboard HMS Westcott in May of 1941, when the system was fired against a known wreck in Liverpool Bay. The test was extraordinarily successful, with multiple projectiles striking the target. Production began 9 months later, and by the end of 1942, more than 100 Allied warships had been fitted with Hedgehog launchers. But initial operational results were deeply disappointing. No U-boats were sunk with Hedgehog until November of 1942, a full year after the first systems had been deployed. The success rate through early 1943 was only about 5%, barely better than depth charges. Escort commanders, accustomed to the psychological satisfaction of watching depth charges explode even when they missed, were profoundly discouraged by Hedgehog's eerie silence when it failed to hit the target. This was more than just a morale problem. It reflected fundamental issues with how the weapon was being employed. Many escort commanders didn't understand Hedgehog's tactical requirements. Unlike depth charges, which could be thrown in the general direction of a submarine contact and might achieve some psychological or cumulative damage effect, even from a near miss. Hedgehog required precise targeting. The circular pattern was only 200 feet across, less than the length of a Type 9C U-boat. The submarine had to be within that circle when the projectiles arrived, or the attack would fail silently. This precision demanded better sonar technique than most operators had developed. It required maintaining steady, accurate tracking throughout the approach. It required calculating the submarine's course, speed, and depth with far greater accuracy than depth charging needed. And it required trust in the weapon system itself, a trust that was difficult to maintain when successful attacks were rare and unsuccessful attacks provided no feedback whatsoever. The Royal Navy became so concerned about Hedgehog's poor performance that in early 1943, a directive was issued requiring captains of Hedgehog-equipped ships to file formal reports explaining why they had not used the weapon when they had an underwater contact. The responses revealed the extent of the problem. Crews lacked confidence in the system. They had received insufficient training. The weapons were sometimes poorly maintained, leading to misfires or incomplete patterns. And fundamentally, many commanders simply preferred the familiar psychological reassurance of depth charges to the silent uncertainty of Hedgehog. The transformation began when the Directorate of Miscellaneous Weapons Development sent an officer to the escort base at Londonderry in Northern Ireland, where many convoy escort vessels were stationed. His mission was to provide intensive training in Hedgehog tactics and to conduct ship-wide talks about successful Hedgehog attacks, building confidence in the system through documented examples of its effectiveness when properly employed. The officer demonstrated that Hedgehog required a fundamentally different tactical approach than depth charging. The attacking ship should maintain a steady course and moderate speed during the final approach, typically 10 knots, rather than accelerating to maximum velocity. This allowed for more accurate sonar tracking and better fire control solutions. The ship should fire the Hedgehog pattern while still at least 200 yards from the target, while sonar contact remained clear and unambiguous. And, critically, if the attack missed, the ship should immediately prepare for a second attack, because the submarine would still be detectable on sonar, unaware that it had been attacked. This last point represented perhaps the most revolutionary aspect of Hedgehog tactics. With depth charges, a miss meant the submarine knew it was under attack and would take maximum evasive action, while sonar contact was lost in the turbulence of underwater explosions. With Hedgehog, a miss was silent. The submarine's crew might not even know a weapon had been fired at them. They would continue on their current course and depth, allowing the escort to maintain sonar contact, reload the Hedgehog launcher in approximately 3 minutes, and launch a second attack with updated targeting information. As crews at Londonderry absorbed this training and gained experience with the weapon, Hedgehog's kill rate began to climb. By late 1943, the success rate had reached 10%. By mid-1944, it had climbed to 20%, and by war's end, the best-trained crews were achieving success rates approaching 25%. This meant that 1 in every 4 Hedgehog attacks resulted in a confirmed submarine kill. To understand the significance of this achievement, it must be compared against the baseline performance of depth charges. Throughout the war, British depth charge attacks achieved approximately 85.5 confirmed kills from 5,174 attacks, a ratio of 60.5 to 1, representing a success rate of approximately 1.6%. Hedgehog, by contrast, achieved 47 confirmed kills from 268 attacks, a ratio of 5.7 to 1, representing a success rate of 17.5%. This was a 10-fold improvement in lethality. But the statistics alone do not capture the tactical and psychological revolution that Hedgehog represented. For U-boat commanders, the weapon fundamentally changed the geometry of combat in ways that undermined every evasion tactic they had developed. The absence of a blind period meant that skilled escorts could maintain fire control throughout the engagement. The forward-throwing capability meant the attacking ship could launch its weapons while still approaching, rather than passing over the submarine's position. The high sink rate meant projectiles arrived at the submarine's depth before any evasive maneuver could be completed, and the contact fuses meant that a single hit, or at most 2 hits, would be catastrophic rather than merely damaging. Perhaps most psychologically significant was the silence. When a U-boat was under depth charge attack, the crew could hear the charges splashing into the water. They could count the seconds until detonation. They could feel each explosion, assess the distance, judge whether the attackers were getting closer or moving away. They had information, however terrifying, that allowed them to believe they might survive through skill and luck. Hedgehog eliminated this information entirely. There was no warning, no sound of projectiles entering the water, no explosions at distance growing gradually closer, just sudden, catastrophic impact, or nothing at all. And because successful attacks were utterly fatal while unsuccessful attacks were silent, U-boat commanders who survived Hedgehog attacks typically had no idea they had been engaged with anything other than conventional depth charges. This created a profound intelligence problem for the Kriegsmarine. German naval intelligence knew, in general terms, that the Allies had developed forward-throwing anti-submarine weapons. Captured Allied personnel occasionally mentioned Hedgehog during interrogation. Technical intelligence from agents in Britain provided fragmentary information about the system. But the true tactical effectiveness of Hedgehog remained obscure, hidden by the very characteristics that made it deadly. When a U-boat was sunk by Hedgehog, there were typically no survivors to report what had happened. The weapon's lethality was such that submarine crews had essentially no time between impact and death to understand the nature of the attack. When U-boats survived attacks and returned to base, their commanders typically reported depth charge attacks because the eerie silence of Hedgehog misses provided no evidence of the weapon's employment. Only when Hedgehog projectiles exploded on the ocean floor, or when sympathetic detonations occurred, would U-boat crews hear unusual sounds that might suggest a different weapon system was being used. The Kriegsmarine's response to the growing submarine losses in 1943 and 44 focused primarily on developing acoustic torpedoes that would allow U-boats to attack their hunters without surfacing. The Falke and later Gnat homing torpedoes were rushed into service, providing submarines with a weapon that could passively home on the propeller noise of escort vessels. These torpedoes achieved some tactical successes, but they did not address the fundamental problem. U-boats were being detected and destroyed by escorts equipped with technology and tactics that German submariners only partly understood. The full tactical potential of Hedgehog was realized when it was integrated into the American Navy's Combat Information Center concept in late 1943 and throughout 1944. The CIC was a dedicated operations room where all sensor information, radar, sonar, visual sightings, and radio intelligence flowed together and was analyzed by a team of specialists. The ship's captain remained on the bridge directing the overall tactical picture, while the executive officer or another senior officer in the CIC coordinated the detailed fire control solutions for weapons, including Hedgehog. This information integration allowed for far more precise targeting. Advanced sonar systems fed depth and position data directly to the CIC. Radar tracks of surfaced or snorkeling submarines could be correlated with sonar contacts. Dead reckoning solutions could account for currents, winds, and the submarine's likely evasive tactics. The result was dramatically improved Hedgehog accuracy from mid-1944 onward, precisely when the weapon was most needed as the climactic phase of the Battle of the Atlantic reached its conclusion. The story of USS England's remarkable achievement in May of 1944 illustrates the full potential of Hedgehog when employed by a highly trained crew with excellent sensors and tactical doctrine. The England was a Buckley-class destroyer escort, displacing 1,400 tons, with a crew of 186. She was not an impressive vessel by the standards of major fleet units, mounting only 3 3-inch guns compared to the 5-inch batteries of fleet destroyers. But she was optimized for anti-submarine warfare, equipped with excellent sonar, depth charge racks, K-guns, and a Mark 10 Hedgehog launcher on her foredeck. More importantly, her crew had achieved an extraordinary level of proficiency through relentless training. Her captain, Lieutenant Commander Walton Pendleton, practiced an unusual command style, delegating extensive authority to his executive officer, Lieutenant John Williamson. Williamson had driven the crew to achieve excellence in all aspects of anti-submarine warfare, with particular emphasis on sonar technique and Hedgehog employment. By the time the England deployed to the Pacific in March of 1944, her crew was supremely confident in their equipment and their skills. The opportunity to demonstrate this proficiency came in May when American codebreakers intercepted and decoded Japanese submarine radio transmissions, revealing that Imperial Japanese Navy headquarters had established a submarine picket line stretching from Truk Island in the Carolines to a point west of Manus in the Admiralty Islands. The purpose was to detect and report on American fleet movements in advance of a major naval battle that Japanese planners believed was imminent. 7 submarines were assigned to this picket line: I-16, RO-104, RO-105, RO-106, RO-108, RO-116, and RO-117. American naval intelligence determined that these submarines represented a critical vulnerability in Japanese plans. If the picket line could be destroyed before the Japanese expected, American forces could achieve tactical surprise in their next offensive operation. The USS England, along with her sister ships USS George and USS Raby of Escort Division 39, were assigned to hunt down and destroy the Japanese submarines. The first kill came on May 19th, when the 3 destroyer escorts intercepted I-16 as she attempted to deliver rice supplies to Japanese forces on Bougainville. I-16 was a large fleet submarine, displacing over 2,000 tons submerged, with a crew of 94 under the command of Lieutenant Commander Yoshitaka Takeuchi, a veteran of 9 war patrols. The submarine was detected by sonar at approximately 2:30 in the afternoon. What followed was a 5-hour hunt that demonstrated both the capabilities and limitations of Hedgehog. The England made 5 separate attack runs on I-16. The first 4 attacks missed, as Takeuchi skillfully maneuvered his submarine, at one point following directly in the England's wake, to confuse the sonar returns. But on the 5th attack, at 2:33 in the afternoon, Lieutenant Williamson achieved a perfect fire control solution. The Hedgehog pattern bracketed I-16 exactly. 4 to 6 projectiles struck the submarine's hull in rapid succession. Each impact punched a 3 to 4 inch hole through the pressure hull. At 200 feet depth, water flooded in at approximately 400 gallons per minute through each hole. The men aboard I-16 had perhaps 90 seconds of consciousness before the rising temperature and pressure killed them. Within 4 minutes, the submarine had descended past its crush depth and imploded. 20 minutes after the attack, debris and a massive oil slick began rising to the surface, confirming the kill. The England's achievement had begun, but neither her crew nor the Japanese Navy yet understood the full extent of what would follow. American codebreakers continued to provide intelligence on the remaining submarines in the picket line. On May 22nd, the 3 destroyer escorts detected RO-106. The USS George initially made radar contact as the submarine cruised on the surface at 3:50 in the morning, then illuminated her with a searchlight. RO-106 dove immediately. George made a Hedgehog attack at 4:15 but missed. The England regained sonar contact at 4:25, made 1 Hedgehog attack that missed, then achieved 3 detonations with her second attack at 5:01. A massive underwater explosion followed, and RO-106 was destroyed with all 57 hands. The following day, May 23rd, the pattern repeated. RO-104 was detected at 6 in the morning. The USS Raby made 4 Hedgehog attacks, all misses. USS George then made 6 more Hedgehog attacks, all misses. The submarine's commander was clearly skilled, evading attack after attack. Finally, at 8:34, the England scored 10 to 12 direct hits with a single Hedgehog salvo. Breaking up noises were heard, followed by a large underwater explosion 3 minutes later. Debris and oil confirmed the kill. All 65 crew members perished. On May 24th, RO-116 was the target. USS George detected her on radar at 1:20 in the morning. England made sonar contact at 1:50 and scored 3 to 5 detonations on her first Hedgehog attack at 2:14. The submarine was destroyed with all 56 crew. On May 26, after resupplying at Manus, the 3 destroyer escorts returned to the hunt. That night, at 11:04, the England detected RO-108. One Hedgehog salvo at 11:23 produced 4 to 6 hits. RO-108 went down with all 53 hands, 4 submarines in 8 days. But the most remarkable achievement was yet to come. On May 30th and 31st, the England and her consorts, now joined by USS Spangler, hunted RO-105 for over 5 hours. The submarine's commander fought brilliantly, evading attack after attack. USS Raby made 2 Hedgehog attacks, both misses. USS George made 6 Hedgehog attacks, all misses. USS Spangler made 1 attack, also a miss. At dawn on May 31st, with the engagement having continued through the night, Commander Haynes, in tactical command aboard USS George, sent a frustrated radio message. "Oh hell! Go ahead, England." At 7:36, the England launched her Hedgehog pattern. 6 to 10 detonations were heard. A major explosion followed at 7:41. Oil and debris appeared on the surface. RO-105 and her crew of 55 were gone. 6 submarines destroyed in 12 days. No other anti-submarine vessel in history had achieved comparable success in such a short time. Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations, sent a message to the England. There will always be an England in the United States Navy. The Japanese submarine picket line had been completely destroyed before it could report any useful intelligence. The tactical lessons from the England's achievements were studied intensively by both American and British anti-submarine forces. Several factors had contributed to the remarkable success. First, excellent intelligence from codebreakers had provided precise information on submarine locations and movements. Second, the England's crew had achieved extraordinary proficiency in sonar technique and Hedgehog employment through intensive training. Third, the Combat Information Center concept had enabled precise fire control solutions. And fourth, perhaps most crucially, the Hedgehog weapon system itself had performed exactly as designed when properly employed. But there was another factor, one that the England's crew could not fully appreciate at the time. The Japanese submarine commanders had been operating with incomplete understanding of the threat they faced. They knew how to evade depth charges. They understood the tactics of acoustic warfare. But they did not understand Hedgehog's forward-throwing capability, its high sink rate, its contact fuses, or the crucial fact that a miss would be silent. They fought bravely and skillfully, using tactics that had been rendered obsolete by technology they did not fully comprehend. The same pattern had been playing out in the Atlantic since late 1942, as Hedgehog-equipped escorts increasingly dominated U-boat hunting operations. German submarine commanders reported puzzling encounters where attacks seemed to develop without the normal warning signs, where evasive maneuvers that should have succeeded somehow failed. Some commanders reported hearing unusual sounds, lighter and faster arriving than typical depth charges. But the survivors were a statistically biased sample. They were the ones who had been missed, who had not experienced Hedgehog's full lethality. The U-boats that were hit by Hedgehog projectiles did not return to report their experiences. They simply vanished, their crews dead within minutes, their hulls resting in water too deep for recovery. German naval intelligence compiled statistics showing that U-boat losses had increased dramatically in 1943 and 1944, but the causes remained partially mysterious. Was it improved Allied sonar, better tactics, more escorts, long-range aircraft closing the air gap? All of these factors certainly contributed, but a significant portion of the increased lethality came from a single weapons system that few German submariners understood even as it killed them. The mathematics of Hedgehog's effectiveness can be understood through a thought experiment. Consider a Type 9C U-boat, 76 meters long and 6.8 meters wide, attempting to evade at 200 feet depth. A Hedgehog pattern of 24 projectiles lands in a circle 200 feet in diameter. The projectiles sink at 23 feet per second, reaching the submarine's depth in approximately 8.7 seconds. During those 8.7 seconds, the submarine traveling at 6 knots, approximately 10 feet per second, can move about 87 feet. But that movement is within the 200-foot diameter of the pattern, and the submarine's length means it presents a target 76 meters, approximately 250 feet long. Unless the submarine is positioned at the very edge of the pattern area when the projectiles land and moving directly away from the center, it is likely to be struck by at least one projectile, and one hit was typically sufficient. The impact of a 65-pound projectile with 35 pounds of torpex created a 3 to 4 inch hole in the pressure hull. At typical combat depths of 200 to 300 feet, this meant flooding rates of 400 to 600 gallons per minute per hole. A submarine struck by multiple projectiles, which was common given the dense pattern, would be taking on thousands of gallons per minute. No submarine damage control procedure could cope with that rate of flooding. The boat would be doomed within minutes. But even before the submarine sank to crush depth, the crew would be dead. This was perhaps the most horrifying aspect of Hedgehog attacks. As water flooded into the pressure hull, it compressed the air inside, raising both pressure and temperature. The relationship is governed by the ideal gas law, but in practical terms, it meant that the air temperature would climb rapidly toward and beyond the boiling point of water. At 200 degrees Fahrenheit, the air would sear human lungs on inhalation. At 300 degrees, survivable time was measured in seconds. The crew would be literally cooked alive by the air they were breathing, dying before the submarine even reached crush depth. This was the truth that U-boat commanders never fully understood. They knew that submarine combat was lethal. They knew that the odds of surviving a full tour of duty were poor, especially in the latter years of the war. The Kriegsmarine's submarine force suffered a 75% casualty rate, the highest of any military service on either side of the conflict. But they imagined death coming through the accumulation of depth-charge damage, through flooding that could potentially be controlled, through explosions that might give them time to surface and abandon ship. They did not understand that an entirely different weapon existed, one that killed silently, suddenly, and absolutely. The strategic impact of Hedgehog extended far beyond the specific submarines it destroyed. By increasing the lethality of anti-submarine attacks tenfold compared to conventional depth charges, Hedgehog fundamentally altered the calculus of the Battle of the Atlantic. Prior to its widespread deployment and the development of effective tactics for its use, U-boats operated with reasonable confidence that they could survive individual encounters with escort vessels through skilled evasion. After Hedgehog became standard equipment on Allied escorts, this confidence was no longer justified. German submarine commanders in late 1943 and throughout 1944 found themselves facing Allied escorts that seemed to possess supernatural hunting abilities. Ships would maintain contact throughout attacks when they should have lost it during blind time. Attacks would arrive faster than depth charges should have been able to reach the submarine's depth, and increasingly, U-boats that made sonar contact with Allied escorts simply vanished, never to be heard from again. The reports from surviving commanders spoke of growing dread, of psychological pressure that wore down even the most experienced crews. Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, who assumed command of the entire Kriegsmarine in January of 1943 while retaining direct control of U-boat operations, watched with mounting alarm as his monthly loss statistics climbed. In November 1942, 13 U-boats had been lost. In January 1943, 7 were lost. By February, 17 were gone. The trend was unmistakable and catastrophic. The exchange rate between merchant ships sunk and U-boats lost, once heavily in Germany's favour, had collapsed. Dönitz and his staff understood that multiple factors were contributing to these losses. Allied air coverage had improved dramatically with the deployment of long-range B-24 Liberators that could patrol the mid-Atlantic gap where aircraft had previously been unable to reach. The introduction of centimetric radar based on the cavity magnetron had made U-boats vulnerable to detection at night and in poor weather when they had previously felt secure. Improved convoy tactics and more numerous escorts made successful attacks increasingly difficult. but the specific tactical changes in how surface escorts were destroying U-boats remained partly mysterious to German intelligence. The Kriegsmarine response focused on technological countermeasures that addressed the threats they understood. New radar warning receivers were developed to detect the centimetric radar used by Allied aircraft and ships. Acoustic torpedoes were rushed into service to allow U-boats to attack their hunters. Snorkel systems were retrofitted to allow submarines to run their diesel engines while remaining submerged, reducing surface vulnerability. The revolutionary Type 21 U-boat was developed, with advanced streamlining, much higher underwater speed, and greater diving depth. All of these measures were sound responses to real threats, but none of them specifically addressed the lethality of Hedgehog, because German intelligence never fully understood what made the weapon so effective. When the war in Europe ended in May of 1945, Dönitz, who had briefly served as German head of state following Hitler's suicide, ordered all U-boats to cease offensive operations on May 4th and to surrender at designated Allied ports on May 8th. Operation Deadlight began, with U-boats still at sea ordered to surface, fly black flags, and proceed to surrender. Many commanders chose instead to scuttle their boats, unwilling to deliver the vessels in which their comrades had died to their enemies. Over 200 U-boats were deliberately sunk by their own crews rather than surrendered. The final accounting was brutal. Germany had commissioned approximately 1,181 U-boats during the war. Of these, 785 were destroyed, with 648 lost to enemy action, and the remainder scuttled, lost to accidents, or stricken from service. Only 156 survived to surrender. Of approximately 40,000 men who served in U-boats, approximately 30,000 died, a casualty rate of 75%. These men had fought with extraordinary courage and skill, but courage and skill could not overcome the technological and industrial advantages that Allied nations had marshaled against them. In the Atlantic theater specifically, 11 of the last 16 U-boat sinkings by American Navy destroyers and destroyer escorts were achieved using Hedgehog or related ahead-throwing weapons. This represented 69% of final stage kills, despite Hedgehog representing only one tool in a larger anti-submarine arsenal. The weapon had proven its worth conclusively by war's end, and its tactical principles would influence anti-submarine warfare for decades to come. The United States Navy retained Hedgehog in service well into the Cold War, only replacing it in the early 1960s with ASROC, the anti-submarine rocket, a system that employed homing torpedoes or depth bombs, but retained the ahead-throwing principle that Hedgehog had pioneered. The Soviet Union developed their own version, the MBU-200, in 1949, which was further developed into the MBU 600 inches 1956 with increased range. These weapons and their descendants remained in service into the 21st century on some vessels. The Royal Navy moved even more aggressively toward advanced ahead-throwing weapons, developing the Squid mortar in 1943, which fired 3 full-size depth charges in a head-throwing pattern with automatic depth setting, and the limbo system that followed in the 1950s. These weapons incorporated lessons learned from Hedgehog, but scaled up the explosive payload to ensure kills against increasingly sophisticated submarines. But perhaps the most significant legacy of Hedgehog was not the specific weapon system itself, but the tactical and technological principles it embodied. The recognition that maintaining sensor contact throughout an attack was crucial. The understanding that weapons should be delivered ahead of the attacking platform rather than dropped after passing over the target. The insight that contact detonation provided more certain kills than proximity detonation. These principles became fundamental to anti-submarine warfare doctrine and influenced the development of all subsequent anti-submarine weapons, from rocket-thrown charges to homing torpedoes to modern vertical launch systems. For the men who had operated Hedgehog during the war, the memory was complex. Some, like the crew of USS England, carried with them the satisfaction of having participated in one of history's most remarkable military achievements, knowing they had helped turn the tide of the undersea war. Others remembered the eerie silence of missed attacks, the psychological strain of combat where success was marked by underwater explosions and failure by nothing at all. All of them understood that they had been participants in a technological revolution that had fundamentally changed naval warfare. In the broader sweep of World War II history, Hedgehog represents one of countless examples of how technological innovation, industrial capacity, and tactical evolution combined to determine military outcomes. It was not a war-winning weapon in the sense of a single device that changed everything. The Battle of the Atlantic was won through the cumulative effect of many technologies, many tactical improvements, many hard-fought convoy battles, and the overwhelming industrial production capacity of Britain, and especially the United States. But Hedgehog was an important component of that victory, one that increased the efficiency of anti-submarine operations at a critical moment in the war. The human cost of this technological story was borne primarily by the submarine crews on both sides. Japanese submariners in the Pacific, German submariners in the Atlantic, both groups faced increasingly lethal threats as the war progressed. Many never fully understood the nature of the weapons being used against them. They fought with the tactics and knowledge they had been given against enemies who had developed capabilities that rendered much of that knowledge obsolete. This was not a failure of courage or skill on their part, but a reflection of the brutal mathematics of industrial warfare, where technological superiority multiplied by production capacity created advantages that individual competence could not overcome. The story that began in the cramped control room of RO 105 on May 31, 1944, with Lieutenant Inoue listening to destroyer propellers overhead, had played out hundreds of times across the Atlantic and Pacific. In every case, the submarine commanders faced an enemy they did not fully understand, equipped with weapons whose tactical characteristics remained mysterious until the moment of impact. Some, like Inoue, died within minutes of being attacked, cooked alive by superheated air as their submarines flooded and sank. Others survived attack after attack, evading through skill and luck, never knowing how close they had come to destruction. The title of this narrative references the notion that 90% of submarine kills from Hedgehog occurred within 90 seconds. This is not a precise historical statistic, but rather a compression of the weapon's essential characteristics. The projectiles reached depth in under 9 seconds. The submarine, once struck, would flood catastrophically within 90 seconds. The crew would be dead, in most cases, before 2 minutes had elapsed from the moment of attack. The round numbers capture a deeper truth. Hedgehog killed quickly, silently, and with a certainty that made it one of the most effective anti-submarine weapons of the war. But beyond the statistics and the tactics, beyond the technical specifications and the kill ratios, Hedgehog's true significance lies in what it represented about the nature of the war. This was a conflict where scientific research and engineering innovation were as crucial as military valor, where production capacity mattered as much as tactical skill, where the side that could integrate new technologies quickly, train personnel effectively, and apply lessons learned across entire fleets would gain decisive advantages. The German U-boat force, in particular, suffered from fighting a campaign decided by factors outside their control. Their submarines were excellent machines, their tactics were skillfully developed, their commanders and crews were brave and professional, but they were fighting Allied forces that possessed radar they could not detect, weapons they did not fully understand, industrial capacity they could not match, and intelligence advantages they could not overcome. By 1944, when Hedgehog tactics had been perfected and the weapon widely deployed, German submarines were being hunted by an enemy that could see them when they believed themselves hidden and kill them before they understood they were under attack. The men aboard RO 105 I-16, RO 104, RO 106, RO 108, and RO 116 died fighting for their country with courage and determination. They also died without understanding the full nature of the threat they faced. This was the final bitter irony of submarine warfare in World War II. The most effective weapon against submarines killed so efficiently that its victims rarely survived to report what had killed them, leaving their comrades to face the same threat without adequate warning. When Lieutenant Inoue stood in that control room on May 31st, listening to the persistent sonar pinging that should have stopped, he was experiencing the final moments of an era in submarine warfare. An era when submarines could reasonably hope to evade their hunters through skill and evasion. An era when the geometry of attack provided opportunities for escape. An era when technology favored the hidden over the hunter. That era ended, not with a bang but with silence. With 24 small projectiles arcing through the air and plunging into the sea, sinking at 23 feet per second, reaching their target in less than 9 seconds, detonating on contact with a submarine hull whose crew had no warning, no chance to evade, no understanding of what had killed them. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.